The angel number. You see during seasons when nothing seems to happen. You catch your reflection and pause, not because anything looks different, because for a second, you did not recognize the way you were standing. You have been quieter this month, less certain about things you used to answer instantly. Friends ask if something happened and you cannot name a single event that explains the shift. Here is the first answer. You are between two versions of yourself right now, and a specific number keeps appearing to mark exactly where you stand in that process. It shows up most often in the days right before an old identity finally loosens its grip. That number carries a precise meaning, and it is not finished with you yet. What it points toward is stranger and more exact than most people ever realize. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which number it is and why it appears at this exact stage and no other. The version that is quietly ending. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. You can rest for 10 hours and still wake up feeling like you are carrying something heavy. That heaviness is not a symptom of anything wrong with your body. It is the weight of a self you are actively outgrowing, one that has not fully left yet. Psychologists who study identity change call this the neutral zone. It sits between the person you used to be and the person you are becoming, and almost nobody warns you how disorienting it feels from the inside. You lose interest in things that used to define you. Conversations that once felt easy now feel like performances. You are not losing yourself. You are shedding a version of yourself that no longer fits. This is the part most people misunderstand. They assume transformation should feel expansive from the very first day, full of clarity and forward motion. In reality, the early stage of real change usually feels like loss first. Before you can occupy a new identity, the old one has to be released, and release always registers in the body as grief, even when nothing external has actually ended. If you have felt strangely tearful about small things lately, or unusually protective of your alone time, this is why. Your system is quietly closing a stage that your conscious mind has not caught up to naming yet. Here is where it gets specific. This closing process rarely happens in silence. It tends to announce itself through repetition, small signals that appear again and again until you finally notice the pattern. For many people going through exactly this stage, one number in particular starts showing up with unusual frequency, almost as if it is timed to the exact moment the old identity begins to loosen. You may have already noticed it without connecting it to what you are feeling. A number on a clock, a total at checkout, a page count, a house number, a license plate you passed twice in one day. Isolated, each instance means nothing. Together, they form a pattern your rational mind wants to dismiss and your emotional mind cannot quite ignore. That pattern is not decoration. It functions more like a marker buoy in open water, showing up at the exact point where the old shoreline disappears from view and the new one has not yet appeared. You are not lost. You are simply between two versions of the map, and the marker is doing its job by reminding you that the crossing is already underway. What that specific number is and why it appears precisely at this stage is worth naming clearly before we go further. Once you know what to look for, you will start noticing it everywhere, and the timing will stop feeling like chance. Why 1212 marks this exact threshold. The number is 1212, not 1111, not 333, not the more commonly discussed sequences people associate with new beginnings in general. Specifically, 1212, and the distinction matters more than it might seem at first. In numerology, the number 1 represents initiation, a fresh cycle starting from nothing. The number 2 represents integration, the process of weaving something new into a stable, lasting form. 1212 doubles both, which practitioners read as a message about a threshold being crossed twice, once internally, and once in how that change shows up in your outer life. It is not simply the number of new beginnings. It is the number of a beginning being confirmed, checked, and set into motion a second time. That structure matches almost exactly what happens during an identity transition. First, there is an internal shift, quiet and mostly invisible to anyone else. You start thinking differently, wanting different things, tolerating less of what used to feel normal. Later, sometimes weeks or months afterward, that internal shift finally becomes visible externally, in a decision, a conversation, or a change nobody saw coming. 1212 tends to appear heavily during the gap between those two moments, almost like it is holding the space open until the second confirmation arrives. This is why the number often intensifies right when you feel least sure of yourself. You have already changed on the inside. The evidence has not caught up yet. That gap between internal certainty and external proof is exactly where 1212 does its clearest work, showing up on clocks, receipts, addresses, and screens with a frequency that starts to feel impossible to explain away. Here's the part worth sitting with. People who track this pattern over months rather than days notice something specific. The frequency of 1212 tends to peak right before a visible decision, then quiet down once that decision has actually been made and acted on. It is not a constant companion. It is a countdown, tied to a very particular kind of readiness. If you are seeing it now in clusters, at inconvenient moments, while you are still unsure what exactly is shifting inside you, that clustering itself is meaningful information. It suggests you are closer to the second confirmation than your uncertainty is currently letting you believe. There is a psychological mechanism underneath this pattern too. It explains why the timing lines up as precisely as it does. It starts with a concept Carl Jung spent decades trying to describe without oversimplifying it. The mechanism Jung spent decades trying to name. Carl Jung called it synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence that cannot be explained by ordinary cause and effect, but that still feels connected in a way the mind registers as significant. He did not mean random luck. He meant a pattern where an inner psychological state and an outer event line up so precisely that dismissing the overlap feels harder than acknowledging it. Jung developed this idea while treating patients going through exactly the kind of transition you may be in right now. He noticed that during periods of major internal change, patients would report strange external coincidences with unusual frequency, almost as if the unconscious mind was finding ways to mirror itself back through the outside world. A repeating number is one of the simplest, most literal forms this mirroring can take. Here is the mechanism in plain terms. Your unconscious mind is already tracking the identity shift long before your conscious mind fully admits it is happening. That tracking shows up as heightened pattern sensitivity. Your brain starts noticing repetition it would normally filter out as background noise, because right now, repetition feels emotionally relevant to what is unfolding inside you. This is not a flaw in your attention. It is a known feature of how the brain prioritizes information during periods of psychological restructuring. Neuroscientists describe something similar when discussing the reticular activating system, the part of the brain responsible for deciding which stimuli deserve conscious attention. During identity transitions, that filter loosens around anything symbolically tied to change, growth, or thresholds, which is precisely the emotional territory 1212 occupies. So the pattern is not something happening to you from outside. It is closer to a feedback loop, your own internal shift making you more capable of noticing external confirmation of that shift, wherever it appears. The number becomes a kind of shared language between what you already know internally and what you are still waiting to see externally. This explains something people in this stage often mention. The number rarely shows up during ordinary settled moments. It shows up during decision points, doubt spirals, and quiet nights when you are actively wrestling with who you are becoming. That timing is not coincidence stacked on coincidence. It is your own heightened awareness meeting a moment when the pattern is genuinely there to notice. Understanding the mechanism does not make the experience less meaningful. If anything, it makes it more precise, because it means the pattern is responding to something real happening inside you, not to random chance. And that precision becomes even clearer once you understand what your body has been doing this entire time, often before your mind caught up. What your body already knows. Long before your thoughts catch up, your nervous system usually already registers that an identity shift is underway. This shows up physically, in ways that rarely get connected back to psychological change, even though the link is well documented. Sleep is often the first thing to change. Not necessarily worse sleep, but different sleep. Vivid dreams, sudden waking around the same time each night, or a strange restlessness right before you finally drift off. Researchers who study sleep during major life transitions have noted something specific. Dream recall increases and dream content becomes more symbolic and emotionally charged during periods of identity change. This happens as the brain works through material during REM cycles that the waking mind has not fully processed yet. Appetite shifts too, sometimes toward less interest in food generally, sometimes toward specific cravings that feel oddly out of character. Your body is recalibrating, and digestion is closely tied to the nervous system, so periods of internal uncertainty often show up as a genuinely different relationship with eating for a few weeks or months. Then there is the restlessness that has no clear source, a low hum of energy that makes sitting still feel uncomfortable, paired with a strange inability to concentrate on tasks that used to hold your attention easily. This is not a lack of discipline. It is a nervous system that senses change coming and has shifted into a more activated, alert state in preparation. Here is the detail worth remembering. These physical signs tend to intensify in the same windows where 12-12 appears most frequently. That overlap is not incidental. Both are downstream of the same underlying process, a nervous system responding to real internal restructuring before your conscious identity has finished catching up to it. If you have noticed your sleep changing, your appetite shifting, or a restlessness you cannot quite name, these are not separate problems to solve individually. They are companions to the same threshold the number keeps marking. Your body is not malfunctioning. It is preparing you physically for a version of yourself it already senses is close. Some people also notice a heightened sensitivity to noise, crowds, or overstimulation during this window. Places that never used to bother you suddenly feel like too much. This is a nervous system running closer to the surface than usual, not a sign of fragility. None of these signs need fixing on their own. They tend to settle naturally once the identity shift completes, the same way physical tension eases once a stressful season finally passes. Treating them as information rather than malfunction tends to make the whole stretch easier to move through. What often changes next is harder to notice from the inside, because it does not happen in your body. It happens in your relationships, and it tends to arrive with more guilt attached than any of the physical symptoms ever do. Why you have been pulling away from people. At some point in this stage, you probably noticed a specific kind of guilt. You want less contact with certain people, not out of anger, but out of something closer to exhaustion. Conversations that used to feel effortless now take visible energy to sustain. You catch yourself letting messages sit longer than usual, and you feel bad about it, even though nothing about the relationship itself has actually changed. This pulling away is not a character flaw. Relationship researchers who study identity development describe a pattern called relational renegotiation, where people naturally reduce contact with relationships built around an older version of themselves, while a new identity is still forming. It is a protective mechanism, not a rejection. Your system is conserving energy for the internal work happening underneath the surface. The people closest to your old identity often feel this shift the most, even when you have said nothing to them directly. A childhood friend, a former colleague, sometimes even a family member, someone who knew a version of you that fit a life you are quietly moving away from. Being around them can feel like being handed a script for a character you no longer want to play, even though you still care about them as people. This is where the guilt tends to spike hardest because most people assume distance means something is broken. Usually it means something is forming. You are not ready to explain a change you have not fully articulated to yourself yet, so silence and distance become easier than a conversation you cannot fully have. Here is what is worth holding on to. This distance is rarely permanent in the way it feels right now. Once the new identity stabilizes, many people find their way back to the relationships that matter most, but from a steadier, more honest place than before. The ones that fall away completely usually needed to, because they were built around a version of you that has already finished its work. If 12-12 has been showing up heavily during a period where you also feel more withdrawn than usual, that is not a coincidence layered on top of another coincidence. It is the same threshold expressing itself in two different directions at once, one internal, one relational. You do not owe anyone a full explanation before you understand the shift yourself. A short, honest boundary is enough for now. Something like, "I need some space right now, but this is not about you," protects the relationship without forcing you to narrate a process still in progress. There is one more resistance worth naming honestly, because it is the part almost nobody expects, and it usually arrives right before the shift finally completes. The old self's last attempt to stay. Right before a genuine identity shift completes, most people experience a strange pull backward. An old habit resurfaces with unusual intensity. A former relationship suddenly texts after months of silence. You find yourself craving the exact routine you worked so hard to outgrow, as if some part of you is making one final case for staying exactly as you were. Psychologists sometimes call this a regression spike, a brief, intense return of old patterns right before real change stabilizes. It is not evidence that the change was fake or that you have failed. It is closer to how a habit responds under threat, an old identity attempting one last negotiation before it finally releases its grip completely. This stage confuses people badly because it feels like proof the whole process was pointless. You did the internal work. You noticed the number. You felt yourself shifting. Then suddenly you are back on the phone with someone who was never good for you, or back in a pattern you thought you had already left behind. That regression is not a step backward in the way it appears. It is closer to the last exhale before a held breath finally releases. Here is the specific detail worth remembering. This spike tends to happen in a narrow window, usually days rather than weeks, and it tends to coincide with a particularly heavy cluster of the number appearing. Many people report seeing 1212 constantly during exactly this brief regression period, almost as if the pattern intensifies specifically because the threshold is closer than it has ever been, not further away. If you find yourself pulled backward right now toward an old habit, an old version of a conversation, an old way of numbing discomfort, this is worth naming honestly rather than judging harshly. It is not weakness. It is the final resistance of a self that is genuinely ending, and endings are rarely graceful, even when they are exactly on schedule. Think of it less like failure, and more like a wave pulling back before it breaks forward again. The pullback can feel alarming in the moment. It is still part of the same motion, not a separate, opposite one. Most people who move through this window cleanly do one thing differently. They stop treating the regression as an emergency requiring a dramatic response. They simply notice it, name it for what it is, and let it pass without feeding it more energy than it needs. What happens on the other side of this particular window tends to arrive quietly, almost without announcement, and it usually shows up first as a change in how frequently the number appears at all. When 1212 starts to fade, there is a specific moment many people describe once the transition genuinely completes. The number simply stops showing up as often, not abruptly, not all at once, but noticeably, the way background noise fades once you finally stop straining to hear it. This fading confuses people who assumed the number would remain a constant companion. It rarely does, and that absence is actually meaningful information rather than a loss. A marker buoy only matters while you are still crossing open water. Once you reach the new shoreline, its job is finished, and it naturally recedes from your attention because your attention is no longer searching for confirmation of where you stand. Some people notice the number continues appearing occasionally, but the emotional charge around it changes completely. Where it once felt urgent, almost insistent, it starts to feel more like a quiet nod, an old friend checking in rather than a signal demanding your attention. This shift in emotional tone is often a clearer indicator of completion than the frequency itself. Here is what tends to happen underneath the surface during this fading period. The gap between your internal sense of identity and your external circumstances finally closes. The decision that had been building quietly for weeks or months finally gets made, or the change that had already happened internally finally becomes visible to the people around you. Once that gap closes, the nervous system no longer needs heightened pattern sensitivity to track an unresolved threshold, because the threshold has been crossed. People often expect this completion to feel dramatic, a clear before and after with an obvious line between them. Almost nobody describes it that way. Most describe something closer to settling, a quiet sense of finally fitting inside their own life again, without fireworks or a defining moment they can point back to later. If the number has already started appearing less for you, that is not disappointment worth mourning. It is confirmation that the work is genuinely finishing. A useful way to track this is simply to notice your own reaction the next time you see it. Early in the process, seeing it often triggers a small jolt, a mix of curiosity and urgency. Near completion, that jolt softens into something closer to warmth. The pattern has not vanished. Your relationship to it has simply changed shape. There is one more layer worth understanding about what waits on the other side of that completion, because it is not what most people expect going in. Signs you are closer than you think. Because this stage rarely feels dramatic from the inside, most people underestimate how close they actually are to completion. A few specific markers tend to show up in the final stretch, and recognizing them can shift a lot of unnecessary anxiety into something closer to steady anticipation. The first marker is boredom with old conversations. Topics that used to hold your attention, gossip, old routines, familiar complaints, start to feel strangely flat. This is not cynicism. It is a sign your attention has already relocated to the person you are becoming, even while your circumstances have not fully caught up yet. The second marker is a specific kind of calm during moments that used to trigger anxiety. A situation that once would have sent you spiraling now gets met with something closer to mild irritation or simple disinterest. Your nervous system has recalibrated its baseline, which is one of the clearest signs that internal restructuring is nearly complete. The third marker is decreased need for external validation about the change itself. Early in a transition, people often feel a strong urge to explain themselves, to justify the shift to friends or family. Near completion, that urge fades. You stop needing others to understand or approve, because your own certainty has become sufficient on its own. The fourth marker, and often the most reliable one, is a change in how the number itself appears. As mentioned earlier, the shift from urgent, insistent appearances to calmer, less frequent ones is one of the clearest signals available that the threshold has nearly closed. Here is what is worth sitting with. None of these markers require a dramatic external event to be valid. You do not need to quit the job, end the relationship, or move across the country for the transition to be real. Internal completion often precedes external change by weeks or months. Noticing these quieter markers can save you from assuming nothing is happening, simply because nothing visible has happened yet. A fifth marker worth mentioning is a shift in how you talk about the future. Plans that once felt vague or distant start sounding more specific, even if nothing concrete has actually changed yet. That specificity is not wishful thinking. It is your identity organizing itself around a version of you that already feels closer than it did a few months ago. What waits on the other side of this stage is not a completely different person, and understanding that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire process. What becoming someone new actually means. There is a common misconception worth correcting directly. Becoming someone new does not mean erasing who you were and replacing that person with a stranger. Carl Jung described a related process he called individuation. The lifelong task of integrating disowned or undeveloped parts of yourself into a more complete, coherent whole. It is addition, not replacement. Under this framework, the person emerging on the other side of this threshold is not a different individual wearing your face. It is a more complete version of you, one that has finally made room for qualities, needs, or ambitions you spent years quietly suppressing in order to fit into an older identity that no longer serves you. This distinction matters because it changes how you relate to the discomfort of the process itself. If you believed you were destroying yourself, every uncomfortable moment would feel like a loss to grieve. If you understand you are integrating parts of yourself that were always there, waiting for permission to exist, the same discomfort becomes evidence of expansion rather than erasure. Jung specifically warned that individuation often requires confronting what he called the shadow. These are the parts of your personality you have kept hidden, sometimes even from yourself, because they conflicted with an earlier version of who you believed you needed to be. This confrontation is rarely comfortable. It often surfaces as the very restlessness, guilt, and relational distance described earlier in this video. Meeting the shadow does not mean becoming someone darker or more selfish. It usually means becoming more honest, admitting needs you dismissed for years, ambitions you called unrealistic, or boundaries you called unkind. Integration simply means these parts finally get a seat at the table, instead of being managed from the outside. Here is the part worth remembering clearly. The version of you emerging through this threshold is not less authentic than the one existing today. It is more authentic because it includes pieces of yourself that circumstance, upbringing, or self-protection previously required you to leave out. This is why the process, however uncomfortable, tends to feel like relief once it settles, rather than like loss. 1212. Marking this specific threshold makes symbolic sense once you see it this way. It is not the number of becoming a stranger to yourself. It is the number of a beginning being confirmed twice, once as the parts of you reassemble internally, and once as that fuller version finally becomes visible in how you live. Understanding this reframes something that tends to worry people most during this stage, the fear of losing the people who only ever knew the earlier, incomplete version of who you were. The fear of losing people who knew the old you. One of the quieter fears during this stage rarely gets said out loud. If you become this fuller version of yourself, will the people who loved the earlier version still recognize you? Will they still want to stay close? Or will the relationship simply not survive the shift? This fear is valid and it deserves honesty rather than false reassurance. Some relationships genuinely do not survive an identity transition, particularly ones that depended on you staying small, agreeable, or predictable in specific ways. That loss is real, and it is allowed to hurt, even while the change itself is ultimately healthy. But most relationships survive this stage far better than fear predicts, particularly the ones built on something more durable than shared circumstance. People who value you for your character, your presence, and your care for them, rather than for a specific role you played in their life, tend to adjust to your growth rather than resent it. The adjustment period can feel awkward, sometimes even distant for a while. But distance during adjustment is different from a relationship actually ending. Attachment researchers describe secure relationships as ones flexible enough to accommodate change in either person without the bond itself breaking. If a relationship has that flexibility, it will stretch to include the fuller version of you emerging now. If it does not, that relationship was likely already more fragile than it appeared, held together by your smallness, rather than by genuine connection. Here is what is worth holding on to through this fear. The people meant to stay through this threshold usually surprise you. They notice the shift, sometimes before you fully name it yourself. Rather than pulling away, many lean in with curiosity instead of judgment. The version of you they end up knowing on the other side is not a stranger. It is simply more of you than they had access to before. Knowing this does not remove the discomfort of the transition itself. It does change how you can work with it, though. Rather than simply enduring it while you wait for the number to fade on its own, it also changes what you say to the people closest to you, even before the shift feels finished. A short, honest sentence, something like, "I have been quieter lately because I am figuring some things out," often does more to protect a relationship than months of silent distance ever could. You do not need a finished explanation to offer an honest one. People tend to respond better to a small, real update than to silence they are left to interpret on their own. How to work with 1212. Instead of just noticing it. Most people relate to a recurring number passively, simply registering it and wondering what it means. There is a more active way to work with this specific pattern that tends to accelerate the sense of clarity people are searching for during this stage. The first step is simple tracking. Each time you notice 1212, briefly note what you were thinking or feeling in that exact moment, without judging the content. Over a week or two, a pattern usually emerges. Specific themes, worries, or desires that keep surfacing right alongside the number. Those themes are typically the exact material your identity shift is asking you to address directly. The second step is discernment rather than forced interpretation. Not every appearance carries equal weight. A single glance at a clock reading 12:12 during an ordinary afternoon means less than a cluster of appearances during a moment of real, emotional weight. A difficult conversation, a major decision, a late night of honest reflection. Learning to distinguish signal from background noise prevents the pattern from becoming a source of anxious over-monitoring. The third step is honoring the discomfort rather than rushing past it. Many people try to accelerate this threshold by forcing external change before the internal shift has stabilized. Quitting a job impulsively, ending a relationship abruptly, hoping the outer change will resolve the inner uncertainty faster. This rarely works cleanly. Internal integration tends to produce more lasting external change than external change forced ahead of internal readiness. The fourth step is simple patience with the regression spike described earlier. If old patterns resurface right before completion, resist the urge to treat that as failure. Naming it as the expected final resistance rather than fighting it or shaming yourself for it tends to shorten how long that stage lasts. Here is what is worth carrying forward. Working with this pattern is not about controlling when the transition finishes. It is about staying present enough to recognize when it already has, rather than continuing to search for a number that has already done its job and started to quiet down. A simple weekly check-in helps too. Once a week, ask yourself plainly what feels different than it did 7 days ago. Small answers count. A conversation you handled differently, a boundary you finally held. These small answers, tracked over time, usually reveal a clearer trajectory than any single dramatic moment ever could. There is one final distinction worth making clearly, because it is the question almost everyone in this stage eventually asks themselves in a quieter, more worried moment. Growth or something else, and how to tell. Everything described so far applies to a genuine identity transition, a process that is uncomfortable but ultimately expansive. It is worth being honest that not every period of disorientation fits that description, and knowing the difference matters for your well-being. A growth transition, however uncomfortable, usually still allows you to function. You can work, maintain basic routines, and connect with people, even while feeling unsettled underneath the surface. The discomfort tends to ebb and flow rather than remain constant, and moments of clarity or relief show up regularly, even during the hardest stretches. If instead you are experiencing persistent hopelessness or a loss of function in daily life that does not lift, that is a different situation. It deserves real support rather than a symbolic framework alone. The same is true if you are having thoughts of harming yourself. A recurring number is never a substitute for professional care. Noticing this pattern should never delay reaching out to a therapist, doctor, or trusted person if you are genuinely struggling. For most people going through what has been described in this video, the experience is closer to growing pains than to crisis. Uncomfortable, disorienting, occasionally lonely, but ultimately moving towards something more integrated, rather than away from stability. The distinction is not always obvious from the inside, which is exactly why it is worth naming clearly rather than assuming. Here is the honest note to close this section. Trusting a pattern like 12-12 to add meaning to your experience is not the same as relying on it instead of real support when real support is what a moment actually calls for. Both can be true at once, a genuine transition and a genuine need for help along the way. One simple way to check in with yourself is to ask a direct question at the end of each day. Did today still have moments of ease, connection, or relief? Even a small amount. If the answer is generally yes, even during a hard week, that is consistent with growth. If the answer has been no for a long stretch, with no relief in sight, treat that as a signal worth acting on directly, not something to interpret symbolically first. Support and meaning are not competitors. Reaching out for help does not cancel the significance of what you are going through. It simply makes sure you have steady ground under you while the deeper process finishes doing its work. With that distinction named clearly, what remains is simply this: where this entire process is actually leading, once the version of you being built right now finally settles into place. Where this actually leads. By the time this threshold finishes closing, most people describe a specific, quiet feeling rather than a dramatic one. Not triumph, not a sense of arrival with fireworks attached. Something closer to finally exhaling after holding a breath for longer than you realized. The fear that drove much of this stage, the fear of staying stuck in an undefined space forever, tends to loosen on its own once the transition completes. Not because every question gets answered, but because you stopped needing every question answered in order to feel steady. That shift from needing certainty to tolerating its absence without panic is the real marker of completion, more reliable than any external milestone. Once that shift happens, the number itself tends to change its role entirely. It stops functioning as an urgent marker and starts feeling more like an occasional nod, a quiet confirmation that the crossing genuinely happened, rather than a signal still demanding your attention. People who have already moved through this exact stage often describe the same realization afterward. They expected the new identity to feel like arriving somewhere specific, a clear destination with a name attached. Instead, it felt more like settling, the way water finds its level once nothing is blocking it anymore. No dramatic reveal, just a quiet sense of finally fitting inside your own life again. Looking back, the earlier version of you will start to feel distant, almost like someone you used to know rather than someone you used to be. That distance is not loss. It is evidence the process worked exactly the way it was meant to, even though it rarely feels clean while you are still inside it. If you are still in the middle of this right now, still uncertain, still noticing 1212 more often than feels comfortable, let this be what you carry forward. The discomfort is not proof that something has gone wrong. It is the sound of an earlier version of you finishing its work quietly, so a fuller one finally has room to begin. You do not need to know exactly who that person is yet. You only need to stop resisting the space where they are already forming, one quiet day at a time, long before you have the words ready to describe them. If 1212 finds you again tonight, let it land differently than it has before. Not as a question you still need answered, but as a quiet, familiar confirmation that the crossing was always going to end exactly here, closer to yourself than you have felt in a long time.